So as said before, my name is Topi Turunen and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Eastern Finland Law School. I'm also working at the Finnish Environment Institute, Syke, as a senior researcher. In Pekka's presentation, I was really happy about that he mentioned the regulation and policies and the importance of waste studies here, because I'm going to be talking about byproducts, waste, and the commodification of waste from the perspective of legislation. So it very well fit, my presentation fits very well after this. So I'm going to be talking about basic legal framework affecting the commodification of waste and classification of byproducts, and some problems we might run to in legal approach to circular economy and commodification of waste. So firstly, how circular economy is connected to waste, I think it's fair material cycles is crucial for circular economy, and the classical approach to this is perhaps talked about a lot in circular economy discussions, is to create more efficient material cycles. So when we're thinking about this from the legal and policy perspective, we're thinking about how to utilize waste and side streams in a more efficient manner. But secondly, there's a second important question, then another approach to this circular economy is to ensure that these materials are safe and fit for purpose. Because if these materials, the wastes and side streams we're trying to use as materials are not safe, then we might run to adverse human health and environmental impacts. And if they're not fit for their purpose, well, then we couldn't use them in the same manner as we would use the primary material. So these both aspects are very important in the commodification of waste and using of secondary raw materials. So basically, it requires balancing between these two views to reach a safe circular economy, which we are aiming for in here. So naturally, it's very relevant to ask how these waste and side streams are regulated under the legislative framework. So basically, this is very much linked with the application of waste legislation and basic rules of the European waste legislation, which is very well, it's implemented in the national waste legislation of each of the EU member states. So basically, the EU waste legislation separates waste and products. So it makes two categories of things in the world. Another ones are considered waste, and the other ones are considered, well, legally accurate word would be just to talk about non-waste, but maybe in order to make it more understandable, I'm going to talk about products here, even though some products can be waste in some legislations. But I'm going to talk about the world of waste and world of products. So for reaching an efficient material cycles, we cannot just stay in the box of the waste legislation, but we need to be able to commodify the waste and move to the block of the product regulation. So basically, the rule is very simple. Since all things are considered waste and or non-waste or products, the waste legislation is applied to materials that are considered waste, whereas it is not applied to materials that are considered non-waste or products. So, and on the flip side of the coin, often the product and chemicals regulation applying to these products are not applied to waste. So basically, we're making two regulatory worlds. One of them regulating on waste and utilization of waste, treatment of waste, and one working with the products and chemicals regulation. So in the waste legislation, therefore, it's very important naturally what materials are considered waste and what materials are not considered waste, well, in a very obvious manner. But in the waste legislation, waste means any substance or object which the holder discards or intends to discard or is required to discard. So basically, each thing that may be useful, maybe not useful, maybe used to has been used to its full potential, or maybe it hasn't been used to its full material potential. Once it's been discarded, it's considered waste, and then the waste legislation is applied to it if it doesn't cease to be waste. There are two exemptions for this basic concept of waste, which is according to the Court of the Justice of the European Union. This concept of waste is being interpreted in a wide manner. So these two exemptions for this concept of waste are byproducts and so-called end of waste. I'm going to be talking a little bit about these now. So firstly, what are byproducts? The Article 5 of the Waste Directive of the European Union states that a substance or object resulting from a production process that primarily aims the primary aim of which is not to produce that substance or object is considered not to be waste, but to be a byproduct if the following conditions are met. Firstly, there needs to be a further use for it that is certain. Secondly, it can be used directly without any further processing other than normal industrial practice. Thirdly, it is produced as an integral part of the production process. And lastly, the further use of the material is lawful. So in other words, the substance or object fulfills all relevant product environmental health protection requirements for specific use, and its use will not lead to overall adverse environmental or human health impacts. So basically what we're dealing with here is that certain side streams of production processes, if we can ascertain that there is a further use for this material and its use is lawful and safe, it should not be considered a waste, but instead it should be considered a byproduct, which is not waste. And this will happen in the very start of the product life cycle. So it's a side product that is being produced in a parallel with the main product of a production process. But however, this doesn't help us with getting from waste back to products, because this only applies in the very start of the product's life cycle and not in the end of the product life cycle. And this is why we have the concept of end of waste. The Article 6 of the Waste Directive of the European Union states that the waste which has undergone a recycling or other recovery operation is considered to have ceased to be waste if it complies with the following conditions. Substance or object is to be used for specific purposes. A market or demand exists for such substance or object. The substance or object fulfills the technical requirements for the specific purposes and meets the existing legislation and standards applicable to similar products, and the use of the substance or object will not lead to overall adverse environmental or human health impacts. So these criteria are very similar to ones set for byproducts. So basically the key things here are, once again, that the material is being used after its recovery, and that it's lawful and safe to use that material. The main difference here, as I already indicated, is that this end of waste, whereas the byproduct status is applied to materials that are made in production processes and are directly deriving from those production processes, this end of waste criteria is applied to materials that have been discarded and therefore are considered waste. So this is the way out of the waste legislation. But in both cases, in the case of fulfilling of the end of waste criteria and in fulfilling of the byproduct criteria, materials that normally would be considered waste are no longer considered waste. And basically, when something ceases to be waste or is classified as a byproduct, the waste legislation is no longer applied to it, but it doesn't fall into a legal vacuum. So applicable product and chemicals regulation is applied to those kind of materials. So the safety of the materials has to be considered in the light of the applicable legislation. So if this kind of materials, the primary materials that are like this couldn't be used in, let's say, certain purposes of use, then the waste-based materials wouldn't be able to be used in those sorts of use either. So there's likely to be set some limits to the use of materials, but those limits usually shouldn't be harsher than those that are laid down for similar primary materials, if there isn't a reason for that. So basically, the applicable product regulation should ensure that the materials is safe to use and it's fit for purpose. But the problem here is that if we don't know the exact composition of the waste, the chemicals that are involved with the waste and different properties of the waste materials, we don't know what legislation is applied. So we might run into the very difficult situations with this. And in the REACH regulation governing the use of chemicals, they have this principle called no data, no market principle, which basically places the responsibility on the industry to manage the risks from the chemicals and provide safety information on the substances, including chemicals registration, applying for authorization and complying with the restrictions. So this would mean that extensive data of the chemical composition of the waste materials would be necessary in order to ensure their safe use. So this would provide makes it very important to identify and track the chemical substances that may be causing some concerns within the waste streams. So here we can see a picture once again about the chemicals regulation is applied when production processes create different kind of materials and products. There we have to comply with the existing product regulation and standards, existing chemicals regulation, including the registration of the REACH regulation and authorization and restrictions derived from there. And once these products or materials that are non-waste are being discarded, they end up in the world of waste once again, and the only way out is to comply with the end of waste criteria after going to a recovery operation. And then again, when we come back to the world of the product and chemicals regulation, we need to comply with those same basic chemicals and product regulation requirements once again. And this, as I already told, might cause some problems. But there's a couple of developments that are likely to not completely overturn the system, but make small amendments and maybe make the chemicals tracking and the commodification of waste a bit easier. Basically, it seems that in the review of the waste directive, and other waste provisions of waste legislation, it seems that these higher recycling rates and possible requirements for minimum recycled material contents are going to put even more pressure on the recycling of different materials. And this even highlights the problem that we have run into with the commodification of waste at this point. The second circular economy action plan of the European Commission lays down some plans for scoping the development of further EU-wide end-of-waste and byproduct criteria in order to harmonize the regulation on certain most important secondary raw material streams within the European Union. And in addition to that, amendments are being made to battery regulations concerning batteries, accumulators, end-of-life vehicles, and packaging products. It also seems like likely that EU will lay down some new kind of requirements and develop some new methodologies for chemicals tracking. For example, the Sustainable Products Initiative has presented a new instrument called Product Passport that could be used in carrying of the tracking of the different chemical data and identification of different chemicals within the waste streams. This has also been strived with the European Chemical agency's SKIP database that looks at the substances of concern in articles according to the REACH regulation. And also the proposed eco design regulation of the European Commission is likely going to extend the different eco design requirements to most product groups, whereas now they're mostly regulating on the energy intensive products. So it is likely that it seems that way, that in the future the EU will lay down new kind of performance standards, for example, some different minimum standards for recoverability, recyclability, use of recycled materials within the different products that will that can help with the chemicals tracking, as well as making the products more recoverable. So that is, we don't know exactly yet, because these proposals are not final. We don't know exactly yet how these might impact the commodification of waste and the problems concerning fulfilling the products and chemicals requirements of the products and chemicals regulation with the secondary raw materials, but surely these will have an impact on that as well. So basically, in conclusion, there are still different interpretations of the EU rules for commodification of waste, and even the EU rules at this point are likely to cause some problems and some hardship for the companies trying to use secondary raw materials. So there's already some hardship in the interpretation of the end of waste criteria in many EU member states, less so with the byproducts, but the development of the new EU wide end of waste criteria for plastics has been started now, and many of the member states are currently developing their methodologies on making decisions on the end of waste. And chemicals management poses some problems in the circular economy. So the tracking of the chemicals and viable technologies for detection of substances of concern are still lacking, but the EU is working hard on giving new tools for this. And the quality of the byproducts and the end of waste products should be high in order to support the use of secondary raw materials in circular economy. So as Pekka talked about, the level playing field between primary and secondary raw materials, this is something that we need to have. We cannot have a lower quality or more dangerous secondary raw materials because then they wouldn't be a suitable alternative for the primary raw materials that we use. So there's still plenty to do in the commodification of waste in the circular economy, but a lot of actions are going on, and a lot of things are going to happen in the near future, and hopefully we'll overcome these problems that we're having currently in the near future. So yeah, I'd like to thank you at this point.